In 1920, the British Empire was the largest empire in human history. It covered nearly a quarter of all land on Earth. It ruled over 400 million people across every continent. No empire before or since has matched its scale. And then within 50 years, it was almost entirely gone. No single military defeat. No revolution at home. Just a rapid, bewildering collapse of the most powerful political structure humanity had ever built. This is the story of how the empire that ruled half the world vanished in 50 years. Chapter 1. The Empire at its peak. By 1920, Britain controlled India, the economic engine of the empire. It controlled vast stretches of Africa, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, and significant parts of Southeast Asia. It commanded the world's most important shipping lanes, and the pound sterling was the global reserve currency. To most British people in 1920, the empire felt permanent. It felt natural. It felt like the way things simply were and always would be. They were wrong. Chapter 2. World War I changes everything. The seeds of destruction were planted in the trenches of World War I. Britain recruited soldiers from across its empire to fight in Europe. Indian soldiers, African soldiers, Australian and Canadian soldiers. Hundreds of thousands of men from colonised nations fought and died for an empire that had conquered their homelands and denied their peoples basic rights. When those soldiers returned home, they came back changed. They had watched the supposedly civilised nations of the world engage in industrial-scale slaughter. The myth of European superiority, the intellectual foundation of the entire justification for empire, had been visibly destroyed in the mud of the Western Front. Across the empire, a generation of men came home asking one question that proved impossible to answer. If we fought and died for Britain, why do we not have the right to govern ourselves? Independence movements began immediately. Gandhi launched civil disobedience campaigns in India. Egypt revolted in 1919. Ireland fought a war of independence that ended with the creation of the Irish Free State in 1922. The empire was already cracking before the second catastrophe arrived. Chapter 3. World War II breaks. If World War I planted the seeds, World War II detonated them. The financial cost of 2 world wars in 30 years was catastrophic. In 1945, Britain was effectively bankrupt. It had borrowed enormous sums from the United States and would spend decades repaying them. The last payment on American war loans was not made until 2006. Meanwhile, in 1942, Japan swept through Southeast Asia, capturing Singapore, which Churchill had called the Gibraltar of the East, in one of the most humiliating military defeats in British history. For the first time, colonised peoples across Asia watched a non-European power defeat Britain militarily. The psychological impact was enormous. If Japan could defeat Britain, then British rule was not natural. It was maintained by force. And once you understood it was maintained by force, you understood it could be ended by force. Chapter 4. India, the beginning of the end. The independence of India in 1947 was the moment the empire began its terminal collapse. India was the ideological heart of it. If India could go free, then everything could. By 1947, Britain lacked the money, the manpower, and most critically, the political will to hold India any longer. The British public had just survived 6 years of devastating war. There was no appetite for another costly campaign to suppress hundreds of millions of people determined to govern themselves. Britain left in August 1947, but in such disastrous haste that the partition into India and Pakistan was completed in weeks. The borders were drawn by a British lawyer who had never visited India and finished the task in just 5 weeks. The resulting violence killed up to 2 million people. 15 million were displaced. Britain's final act in India was to create a catastrophe and then leave before the consequences became fully visible. Chapter 5. The Suez Crisis. In 1956, Egyptian President Nasser nationalised the Suez Canal. Britain and France secretly conspired with Israel to launch a military invasion to retake it. The old imperial reflex. When Britain faced defiance, it sent in the army. But America refused to support the operation. President Eisenhower threatened devastating economic consequences if Britain did not immediately withdraw. Britain, bankrupt and exposed, had no choice. It withdrew in humiliation. Suez made undeniable what had been true since 1945. Britain was no longer a superpower. The empire had been built on military and economic dominance, and both were gone. What remained was a performance of imperial power that the rest of the world could see through, even if Britain could not admit it yet. Chapter 6. The Wind of Change. In 1960, British Prime Minister Harold Macmillan delivered a speech that captured what was happening with unusual honesty. The wind of change, he said, is blowing through this continent. Whether we like it or not, this growth of national consciousness is a political fact. What followed was breathtaking. Ghana gained independence in 1957. Then the floodgates opened. Nigeria in 1960, Tanzania in 1961, Uganda in 1962, Kenya in 1963, Zambia in 1964, and on through the decade until almost every British territory in Africa had become an independent nation. Britain had not been expelled by military defeat in most cases. It had simply run out of the will to maintain control against populations determined to govern themselves. Chapter 7. What was left behind? The speed of the collapse meant Britain frequently left behind chaos rather than stable foundations. Borders drawn for British administrative convenience, rather than ethnic or cultural reality, became the borders of new nations, creating tensions that in some cases exploded into civil wars and genocides. Economies built entirely to extract raw materials for British industry left new nations structurally dependent on their former coloniser. In Kenya, Britain conducted a brutal counter-insurgency campaign in the 1950s, detaining over 150,000 people in camps, where torture was systematic. Documents were secretly destroyed before independence. It was not until 2012 that Britain acknowledged the abuses and paid compensation to survivors. Chapter 8. Why it vanished so fast. The honest answer is that the empire had always been more fragile than it appeared. It was maintained not by genuine consent, but by military force, economic dependency, and a set of stories about civilization and progress that eventually stopped being believable. Once those stories lost their power, the whole structure began to shake. World War I shook it. World War II nearly broke it. India cracked it open. Suez proved it was hollow. And then the wind of change blew through, and what remained fell almost all at once. Empires are built on force and maintained by narrative. When the narrative fails and the force is no longer sufficient, the empire does not decline gradually. It collapses. The British Empire ruled half the world, then the story it told about itself stopped working. And within 50 years it was gone, leaving behind borders, debts and consequences the world is still living with today.